I'm calling this class, by the way, just an orientation to what we're going to do for the next 2 weeks, and then it's a model we're going to repeat in a couple of weeks for another occasion. In April, 20 pilgrims from Church of the Holy Communion set out on a journey to the Holy Land. And we are going to report back on that next week. But my hope is that anytime someone comes to Sunday school at Holy Communion, there's learning and content there in addition to sort of the fun travel log. So what we're going to do today is a class that I am just so excited to be teaching about the geography and the layout of the Holy Land, which I think reveals pieces of the scriptural story that we can too easily miss when we don't take that time to study the geography. And then next week we'll be having the reflections on the trip. A couple of weeks from now, and I'm not remembering exactly the date, Hester will be giving a presentation on Celtic spirituality, and then the week after that we'll have our youth pilgrims who went to Scotland last year report on their journey. So that's sort of the model that we're using in the hope that we will be able to deepen our own spirituality even as we learn about the journeys of others. I'm calling this class the Fifth Gospel, which is not a name that I coined myself. What did Shakespeare say? Good writers borrow, great writers steal. This is definitely stolen. But the idea is this, that the Holy Land itself, that geographical territory, has truth to reveal to us. It has good news, euangelion, gospel, to reveal to us. And that in going and studying that place, we get a sense that we don't get just in reading the scripture. We start in this place, though. Anybody know the song? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 You sound lovely. Lovely. We need to get some of you folks in the choir. Indeed, God does have the whole world in his hands. Indeed, God did make the whole of the world. But for our faith and the faith of our Jewish brothers and sisters, this one section of the world is pretty significant. This is the section where God chose to focus all of those efforts. This is the place where our faith is grounded. When we start to divide this up, there's a question to be asked of how do you divide it? So do we divide it politically? Do we divide it geographically? What I'm going to do is, for the first slide, walk you through what the current political boundaries are of this area so that we can review our geography. And then we'll take the current boundaries off and then explore it from a biblical perspective. So this will help just put us in context. If we put the map up, and it's very difficult to come up with maps of this region that really work, so just work with me. I'm trying real hard. We have a very, very small area that is the current state of Israel. It's this region here, if you can see the pointer, that goes up and stops right in here. The state of Israel. The State of Israel was created by UN Resolution 181 on November 29, 1947, recognized by the United States President Harry Truman on May 14, 1948. The whole area of Israel is, and forgive me for using my notes here, 8,000 square miles, of which 172 square miles is inland water. From the furthest north point to the furthest southern point, 263 miles. So what would that be? From here to Little Rock, maybe? Maybe a little bit beyond that? Not as far as Bentonville, if you've been up to Crystal Bridges. From north to south, 263 miles, and at its widest point, from east to west, 71 miles. At its narrowest point, 9 miles. This is a small country and a small area. You'll notice there's a red boundary tucked into the state of Israel there. That is the Palestinian West Bank, right there. You'll also see another little spot here. I didn't mark it. This is the Gaza Strip. And then the Golan Heights are up here. If you look very closely, you'll see two orange lines there, and I'll come back to those in a second. But when we're listening to the news and we're hearing about reports, this is the West Bank, this is the Gaza Strip, and this is the Golan Heights up there. We have a few other countries represented in the neighborhood. Syria, up at the top. What's this country over here next to... oops, sorry, clicked the wrong button. That's Iraq. This country over here? Lebanon, exactly. What's next? This is Saudi Arabia. Jordan, people had mentioned, is in here. So, and this is significant to political discussions, Jordan actually lies between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's tucked in the middle. And then what's this large country down here in the North African continent? That's Egypt. These are all pretty politically active countries right now. And if you remember what I said, from top to bottom, Israel is 250, give or take, miles. So we're talking about probably this slide 500 or 600 miles from top to bottom, and we have all of those countries packed in there, all of that tension and conflict in that very, very narrow area. I'm going to lift off all of the political boundaries here for a moment and go back to our geography. We started with Egypt, right? And Egypt is where it has been for thousands of years. What's this peninsula here? Sinai, very good. It's got Mount Sinai on it. Then the Israelites came out of Egypt and into the Sinai, word starting with a W. Wilderness, thank you very much. And then they went into the Promised Land. This is a satellite photograph. Look at the colors. There's a lot of desert out there. Lots of desert, lots of arid, lots of dirt, not a lot of vegetation, not a lot of life-giving water, except right there we have water. And that becomes very significant as well. I'm going to zoom in on that particular water for just a second. What is this body of water here? Dead Sea, and up here, Sea of Galilee, and the water that runs in between them? Jordan River. Now, this is the really important stuff. This is where we're going to get into the meat. So I have drawn you a cartoon to help you appreciate it all. Some of you have seen this slide before. What do we have up top? Galilee, down the bottom, Dead Sea, in between, Jordan River. And what is on the west side of the Jordan River? And what's on the east side of the Jordan River? This is all you need to know about Holy Land geography. If we can hold on to this one picture, we'll be in great shape. If you're on the west side of the Jordan River, you are in the Promised Land. If you're on the east side of the Jordan River, you're in the wilderness. If you're in the Promised Land, it's the land that was foretold and promised to Abraham, the land of milk and honey, the land where everything is good, the land that the Israelites literally for thousands of years have been seeking to hold and possess. And if you're out on the other side of the Jordan River, you are in the wilderness. Those of you who have been here for 3 years or more will remember that my very first class in this room was on the subject of wilderness stories. And I taught about several wilderness stories, and I gave you a repeated theme. And it was this: when you go into the wilderness, what happens? You meet God before you leave. It's 100% true in the biblical narrative. When our characters go out into the wilderness, they meet God there before they leave. We see it with the Israelites, and we're going to talk about them in a moment, where they learn to trust God and learn to rely on God. We see it with Elijah and Elisha, who go out into the Promised Land, and then God takes Elijah up in a fiery chariot. We see it with Jesus when he's driven into the wilderness and is tempted by Satan. Anytime you go into the wilderness, you meet God there before you come back. Wilderness, unhappy place. Promised land, happy place. But wilderness is where we meet God, perhaps because it's in the wilderness that our defenses are down and we are least reliant on ourselves. And we have to be reliant on God. All right, so let us take a journey through the Promised Land. Now, since coming to Holy Communion, I have learned some things about the South. I thought that I was living in the South when I was in the mountains of Virginia, and you have come to teach me that no, indeed I was not. In fact, I remember saying to my former boss who used to live in Memphis, when I started looking at Holy Communion, I said, now I don't know about this. I mean, that's like the deep South down there, and I mean, up here in Virginia, we're kind of like the mid-South. We're like the Mid-South. And he says, well, it's interesting that you say that because they call themselves that too. So when I got here, what I learned was the significance that land has for the people of this region. The Mississippi Delta has given us feet, dozens of feet in many cases, of rich, fertile topsoil. Where I came from in New England, we measured topsoil in inches, not in feet. As a result of that, you have a rich agricultural economy. You have an economy that is built around the commerce of agricultural products, the working river, what the river has done to the land. And then beyond that, your story is knit into the land. And so many people, I visited you in family homes that have been in your lineage for a long time, or you've talked about, and this was the land where my grandfather's farm was, or this is the land where it was, and it's impossible to separate the land from the story for people who have been here a while. And what I would like is, as we go through the stories of our ancestors in the wilderness or in the Holy Land, to put yourself in that place. In fact, people of this region might be better able to understand why the land is so important than many people. So put yourself in that place to say the land and the people and the story cannot be separated from one another. So let's start here. If you wanted to start at the very, very beginning, what spot would I be looking for? The very, very beginning, Genesis chapter 2. Garden of Eden. Currently somewhere in Iraq. We don't have a location of the Garden of Eden, but heading over towards the Persian Gulf a little bit off this slide. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are the stories of humanity. It's big. So we have Genesis 1, the story of creation in 7 days. We have Genesis 2, the story of the Garden of Eden. We have in there Noah's Ark. We have in there the Tower of Babel. We have all of these things that are about us as a whole universal family. But beginning in Genesis chapter 12 and continuing for the whole rest of the Bible, it is the story of one family. And whose family is that? Abraham and his descendants forever. Abraham, Genesis 12, verses 1 to 5. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abraham took his wife Sarai, his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. So we have two places mentioned there. What are the two places? Haran, where Abraham was when he was called, and Canaan. In other words, what will later become to be known as the Promised Land. So Abraham's call goes from somewhere up here. I was once asked by a professor what the first mention of Jerusalem is in the Bible. And our minds all started going to the era of the kings and David and Solomon and the temple and all of that. And he said, no, you're off by some distance. Listen to this, Genesis chapter 14. So only 2 chapters after Abram is called. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him, that is Abraham, at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." So what do we have there? We have this guy who we meet only for the first time at the end of Genesis chapter 11, who we know very little about, being called by God to go to a place that God's not going to tell him in advance. Just start walking, God says, and I'll show you where you're going to go. Let's not underestimate the significance of that. Pack it all up, get in the car, start driving. I'll tell you when you got there. No plan, no hotel reservation, no real estate agent, no transition officers. Get in the car and start going. Abram has some military conquests along the way, beginning to introduce this theme that Israel is victorious in battle when they are faithful to God, a theme that's repeated throughout the Old Testament, and we see it as early as chapters 12, 13, and 14. And then he gets to the place that God showed him, Canaan, and there's a king there. But the king is a priest of the Most High God. A king of the Most High God. And so in Salem, Jerusalem, Abraham finds that God called him out to a place that he was not to be shown, and God beat him there. Abram ended up in a place where God was already being worshipped. He had faith, he set out, and God went ahead of him. And just in case you missed the message, in chapter 15 and verse 1, the Lord comes to Abram and says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." This is holy land. From the very earliest part of our creation, this is holy land. Fast forward the story a little bit. Abraham has a son, actually has two sons, and their names are Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael being the ancestor of the Arabs, Isaac being the ancestor of the Jews. Isaac, we're going to follow his line down for a second. Isaac has a son whose name is Jacob. Jacob has how many sons? 12 by how many wives? 4 wives. Always helpful to remember that they were not all Sarah's kids, and there's a daughter in there as well. And then we get that wonderful story of Joseph, who is the favored son, and how do his brothers feel about him? We're not terribly loving of Joseph, and somebody says, "Let's kill him." And somebody else, not to be outdone by his brother, says, "Oh, better still, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery, and then we'll get some money out of the thing rather than just killing him. That would be foolish," right? One of those great examples of, I did a Bible study once called Men Behaving Badly, and that's a really good example for that. So Joseph, sold into slavery, ends up where? Egypt. And in fast forwarding here through a lot of history because I want to get back to the land, in Egypt, he demonstrates an ability to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. Long story short, he ends up in charge of all of the Pharaoh's estate. He is the one who is collecting in the grain and the supplies because he has foretold a famine in the land. There is a famine in the land, and who gets hungry? Jacob/Israel and all of his sons get awfully hungry because there's no food where they are, and they go down into Egypt, and lo and behold, there's Joseph. Lots of detail being left out. Much to their good fortune, Joseph says in Genesis chapter 50, "Do not be afraid." Where have we heard that phrase before? With Abram. "Do not be afraid, Abram, I am your shield." Now Joseph to his brothers who decided not just to kill him but to sell him into slavery, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. Have no fear. I myself will provide for you and for your little ones." In this way, Joseph reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So Joseph remained in Egypt, and he and his father's house and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. To the children of Machir and the son of Manasseh were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, "When God comes to you, you shall carry up my bones from here." And Joseph died, being 110 years old, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. It's not the end of the story that we're expecting, is it? Not only has Joseph forgiven his brothers for this terrible act, he's now invited them and their families to come and live with him in luxury and in plenty in Egypt. But that's not enough, because it's not their land. It's not that particular acreage that God had promised to them. We can live in the lap of luxury in New York or in Boston or in Philadelphia, but this is our land. This is my people. This is where my roots are. So even with all of that luxury and power and access and exposure and influence, the land was still Joseph's primary concern. And he made his brothers promise that even in his death, they would carry him back up there when it was time. Well, this unfortunately doesn't last very long. You flip the page into Exodus, and what happens at the beginning of Exodus? Not quite. Something before that. A new Pharaoh arises in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And he says, "Whoa, look at all of these people. Look at all of these Hebrew people. If they were to get organized and revolt, they could overthrow the whole empire." And so it is out of fear, which is the opposite of what God has been saying on a number of occasions already this morning. It is out of fear that they band together and enslaved the Hebrews. And then it's out of fear that they release them. Again, long story short, after all of the plagues. Exodus chapter 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people a roundabout way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt prepared for battle, and Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, "God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here." They set out from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Do not be afraid. And do not get so afraid that you turn backwards and choose slavery over freedom because it's familiar. Another repeated theme. My Old Testament professor in seminary described Israel's time in the wilderness as their honeymoon with God. Their honeymoon with God. You might want to say to them, well, Bali is nice too, or any number of other tropical locations. You should get a better travel agent is another response to that. But if you think about her point, it's a good one. The time in the wilderness was Israel's time away with God. They were alone with each other, learning how to anticipate one another, learning how to dance with one another, learning what it was going to be to live with one another forever. In the wilderness, God gives them the law. It's easy to say, oh, well, the law is the long list of do's and don'ts. But if you read it with this idea of a loving God and a people that he loves, it becomes the way of saying, you're going to be mine and I'm going to be yours. And the way that people are going to know that you're mine is that we are not going to be acting the same way as everybody else. There are certain things that we are going to set aside because we love each other and because we're family. And if you think about that, when I work with couples in premarital conversations, I always say to them, so why bother getting married? Many of them are already living together. They're publicly engaged. They've exchanged a ring, at least one. They're starting to combine their household finances and all that. And I just say, so why get married? What will be different? And the answer, after they fumble around a little bit universally, is that what's different is that you are giving up the right to just keep on driving at the end of the day. Fundamentally, when you're just engaged or just dating, you can keep on driving. But once you're married, you can't. You're setting aside a privilege. You're setting aside a right. You're setting aside a piece of your independence to say, I'm with you. And that's what Israel does. When they're out in the wilderness, what are they eating? Manna. And then for a nice Sunday dinner, quails, manna and quails for 40 years. What's the thing about manna? How does it keep? It doesn't. You can only take enough for that day or 2 days on the night before the Sabbath because you have to rely on God. You cannot, in the wilderness, survive by your own industry. And so God takes them away, strips away any semblance of self-reliance that they had anywhere in their body, and says, you're mine. And you're going to trust me. And we're going to be in this together. Do you see the honeymoon aspect there? The forging of that love that's going to bind them together as they head into the hard times that are to come. Now, remember what I said. The state of Israel is only about 250 miles tall, so we may be looking at 600-700 miles at most from top to bottom on this image. That's not a small distance. Would it take you 40 years to walk it? Probably not. So, and we even have Exodus saying that God takes them a circuitous route so they don't get afraid. He takes them out into the wilderness of the Red Sea. So we get over there. So this introduces, and this is my proprietary theology, and someday I will publish a paper on this and become a very famous and wealthy theologian. Because, Phil, I'm sure you know anyone who publishes papers on the Old Testament is a phenomenally wealthy individual. Here's my theology, and I introduce it in this way. Imagine yourself in junior high school gym class. And imagine that you're out on the track and you have been sort of futzing around on the side, or you've been talking when you weren't supposed to, and the coach says to you, all right, boys, one more time around, we're going to do this until we get it right. I think that we see here the gym teacher theology of the Old Testament, that God is out there saying, you just don't get it, but I'm going to keep you going around this track until you get it, until you figure it out. And he keeps giving them more chances and more lessons, and he walks them through all of this until they ultimately arrive at Mount Nebo. So 40 years, they transit this distance. Mount Sinai is right about here where they get the law. And they transit up to Mount Nebo. And what is the significance of Mount Nebo? Absolutely, perfectly correct. So Moses has had an indiscretion in the wilderness, and his indiscretion is that he failed to trust God. It had to do with water and a stone and all those things, but the real issue at hand was that Moses did not trust God. And as a result of that, God penalizes him and says, you will see, but you will not enter the promised land. So we get up here onto Mount Nebo on which side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea? East side. But he looks over the river and he sees the promised land. But now look for just a moment at the satellite picture. What is he looking at? More dirt. Jerusalem is a city built on 3 hills, and coming from the east and going to the west, it's the Mount of Olives, Mount Moriah, and Mount Zion. And on the western side, so the Mediterranean side of the Mount of Olives, it's lush and green and filled with olives. On the eastern side, which faces the Jordan River, it's a desert, completely deserted, completely arid. Moses could not see over the Mount of Olives to see the greenery on the other side. He just saw more dirt. But his faith was such. His faith was such as to say, this is the promised land. And indeed it was. Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 to 9. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, and that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zor. And the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I've let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded. Questions or thoughts? What are you seeing when you see these stories sort of mapped out with a criminal amount of detail left out of the story? What are you noticing? Oh, gotcha. If he'd gone straight up rather than taking the gym teacher route, he certainly would have been better. But remember, he wasn't navigating, because that's not how this whole deal works. From Abraham, we see that they don't get to steer their course. The Israelites were led by the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire to get to the promised land, and I'm not remembering if they didn't stay with them through the rest, did they, Phil? Out in the wilderness. The pillars, they didn't stay. Once they crossed the wilderness, they were gone, right? Yeah. He needed GPS, but didn't have it. So indeed, he would have been better, but this is another example of we're taking the long road. Anything else that you're noticing? Let's zoom in a little further. Takes the Israelites across the Red Sea. But he doesn't do it, across the Jordan River, but he doesn't do it in the same way that Moses took them across the Red Sea. What's different? So when Moses crosses the Red Sea, he comes up to the Red Sea, and then what does he do to make it part? Hold a staff. Now, if you are watching Charlton Heston do it in the movie, whoosh, if you read the Bible, it says that a strong wind blew all night and pushed the waters back. So imagine that for a moment. Moses is standing there with his arms out, and a strong wind blows all night to push the water back. The Egyptians are coming up behind you, and you have to trust that God is going to keep that wind going all night and that it's going to be enough to pile up the water. Well, now we're coming out of the wilderness time, and Joshua does it a little bit differently. God tells him to tell the priests to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and step out into the water. And they have to get into the water before the water will part. The Jordan and the Mississippi are not comparable, but say, just for the sake of argument, that I asked you to lead this congregation across the Mississippi, and I said, Sarah Cowens, you're going to take point for us. You won't mind stepping out and trusting that the river is going to push back. That's sort of where we were. Again, not comparable rivers, but just put yourself in the space. So Joshua tells the priests that they have to step out ahead of the people, and then indeed the waters do part. They camp at Gilgal first. Long story short, they take their first conquest at Jericho, and they are now in the land. And the people then move again towards Jerusalem. But they don't get to stay in Jerusalem forever. As we go from Joshua to the Judges, the repeated theme in the book of Judges is there was no king in Egypt in those days. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. You can imagine how well that worked. And this theme starts to repeat itself of when Israel is faithful, they're victorious and they're in the land. When Israel is not faithful, they are taken from the land, and we enter into the time of the Babylonian captivity. Where is Babylon? East and up. It's in sort of the Iraq area now. So if you're going to go from Jerusalem to Babylon, you have to go north, right? And so who are the first people who are going to be taken? So the Babylonians are going to come from the north for conquest, right? And so they're going to get the people who are in the north first and the people who are in the south later. Hang on to that for just a second. We get long essays about the captivity in the prophets, but this, I think it's best recorded in the Psalms. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. You could read it in the prophets with a lot of detail, or you could compress it down to that. When we were in Babylon, we sat down and we wept. But the captivity doesn't last forever. And in Psalm 126, we get the return. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then were we like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongues with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. And we rejoiced. I think that perfectly captures the exile. Now, if I had further confused this map that I'm working with, I would have told you that there are 3 regions in the Promised Land side of the river. In the south is Judea. In the north is the Galilee region around the lake. And who's in the middle? Samaria, or the people of that land, the Samaritans. And what do we remember Jesus saying about Samaritans? How did they get along with the Jews? John chapter 4, verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Parenthetical note, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. And there's a line of thinking that suggests that the Samaritans were taken first into the Babylonian captivity. And when everything was restored, they found that some of the people in Jerusalem had sort of modified a little bit. And while they were off suffering in captivity, the people in the city were figuring out how to make it work. And they came back in and found this faith that was so different from the faith that they left, that they wanted nothing more to do with the Jews. That conflict has to do with the geography. Who was north of whom? Who was closer to Babylon? And we lose that piece of texture in the story. Let me quickly jump into the New Testament. I've got so much more that I want to say, but time doesn't allow. All right, same map. A couple of thousand years later, well, dozens of hundreds of years later, we have Jesus. Annunciation in the north. What's the Annunciation? Gabriel says to Mary, "Do not be afraid." There it is again. All of these geography stories having to do with do not be afraid. Gabriel comes to Mary, "Do not be afraid." To Joseph, "Do not be afraid." And then where do they go from there? They go to visit Elizabeth in some readings, which is down by Jerusalem, and then the birth takes place in Bethlehem. It's a long way on a donkey when you're pregnant. Then after that, we have a difference in Matthew and Luke of whether they go to Jerusalem and present the baby at the temple or whether they go into Egypt and keep the baby in hiding. But long story short, they end up back in Galilee region for Jesus' ministry. The vast majority of Jesus' teaching is going to happen in the Galilee region. The calling of his disciples is going to happen in the Galilee region. And I marked 2 dots on there. Those are the towns of Capernaum and Bethsaida. Capernaum and Bethsaida. These were names that were not significant to me until I got to explore this land in a little bit more detail. Capernaum is on the left or to the west, and that is the hometown of St. Peter. Bethsaida is to the east, and that is the hometown of Philip and Andrew and John. I have an error in my notes. I think it's Philip and Andrew and John. Is that right? The sons of Zebedee? Something like that. So we've got them on the east. We've got Peter on the west. Here's what I didn't know until recently. When Herod the Great dies, so Herod the Great is the king that Rome has in place to govern the Jews. Herod the Great dies, and his 2 sons, Herod Philip and Herod Antipas, divide his kingdom. Capernaum is in the tetrarchy of Philip. Bethsaida is in the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas. So they are now governed by different princes, each of whom is competing for the title of his father to be the king of the Jews. There's a significant phrase for us, isn't it? So the place where Jesus goes to say, I'm the king of the Jews, is a place where 2 competing authorities are trying to say, no, actually, I'm the king of the Jews. And he spends all of his time up there and around the lake where these questions are most significant. And he talks about a different way and a different kingdom. We start our journey down towards Jerusalem. We make a stopover in the plain of Jezreel, which is a large open area. And it says in the scripture that Jesus goes up a high mountain. There's only one there, so we believe it to be Mount Tabor. And at the top of Mount Tabor, he is transfigured before them. And his face becomes a dazzling white. And to whom does that connect him? Moses, whose face was a dazzling white as well. And it's here that he has Peter and James and John up on a high mountain and is transfigured before them. And they can see through his exterior to that holy and divine core and be commissioned to go on to Jerusalem. Geography matters. As I've said, Jerusalem is a city built on 3 hills. And as you're coming into the city from Bethphage and Bethany, which is where Jesus is said to have entered, you're at the top of the Mount of Olives. And then there is a valley called the Kidron Valley, at the bottom of which is Gethsemane, which will be important later. Steep valley, and then a steep rise onto Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah is significant because back in the whole Abraham section of our presentation, that's where he sacrificed Isaac, or where he took Isaac to be sacrificed. So Jesus starts at Bethphage and Bethany and walks almost straight downhill with the feeling of gravity pulling him forward. And when he gets to the bottom of the hill, there's the garden where he's going to pray a couple of days later. And here's the whole city, Roman imperial power, on top of him. And he climbs up into Jerusalem, again up a steep hill, as Abraham did with Isaac on that same hill, to prepare for his own sacrifice and subsequent resurrection. What does this map tell us? What did we notice about the previous map? It was circuitous, right? It was up and down. And we see the same thing here, up and down. Ours is a faith on the move. We're a faith that would have loved to have been grounded in one spot. Abraham would have been so happy just to say, Haran is great, and I'm going to stay here. But God says you're going to be on the move. The story of Jesus goes up and down, north and south, back and forth. The Gospel of John is actually not even organized chronologically, so Jesus can jump from Galilee to Jerusalem and back without any passing time. But the example that we have of this story and of the Old Testament story is that ours is a faith on the move. And no matter how much we might want to stay in one single place and hold on to it for dear life, that is not the witness of our ancestors. And what they find is that when they're called out of those places, they find God there too. The Jerusalem cross that many of you have seen is this image, and it portrays Jerusalem or the Holy Land as the center of the world. And you can think about that image where we started, the cradle of creation. It gives you the large cross in the center and then the four corners of the world coming in. The old city of Jerusalem is also a city of four quarters, and so the symbol represents that as well. But you can see that this is grounding us in a center place. They say of the region that the living stones, if you remember back to Jesus where he said that if I were silent, the stones themselves would cry out. Our current Christian brothers and sisters over there refer to themselves as the living stones. And one of those living stones gave us this prayer to hold on to. 9 measures of blessing God gave to the world. It should be 10. 10 measures of blessing God gave to the world, 9 for Jerusalem and 1 for the rest. 10 measures of sorrow God gave to the world, 9 for Jerusalem and 1 for the rest. And what our friends have asked us to do is to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the Christian witness there, pray that God can be revealed there. But as we look at this history and we look at our current situation, we're going to be a faith on the move for a while, going in and out, back and forth. But God will be with us, as he always has been. I think our pilgrims who are going to offer the reflection next week can do that better than I. For me, the biggest shock was seeing the desert and how big it was and how close it was. And literally, there's a university on top of the Mount of Olives. And if you're looking west from the university, you see green, lush buildings, city. And if you look east from the university, standing on the very same spot, you see barrenness and dirt as far as the eye can see. And how many climates we went through as well, that we were in a rugged climate in Jerusalem with lots of rock outcroppings, lots of olive trees. Then you had desert, all dirt as far as the eye could see. And then if you're up in the north, it's very lush and green. And if you head towards the very north, where Caesarea Philippi is, we didn't make it that far on this trip, it's mountains, high mountains that you could ski on, all in the space of 300 miles. Less than that, actually. Other comments or questions? I think there's a lot of learning going on there by a lot of people on every side of this issue. And what I'll say also is that the conflict between Jews and Arabs in that place, the Christians are about 2% of the population. So we are not going to be a controlling factor in this. But what our friends have done is said, well, we're not going to be a decider here. So let us create a space where people can be convened. Let us create a space where children can be educated. Let us create spaces where sick people can be healed, regardless of your faith. And I think that right now that's perhaps the best witness that we could possibly be offering in that region. All right, so just a little story on myself. When I was in seminary, I hated this part of Old Testament studies. The professor said that we had to be able to diagram a map. And I said, oh gosh, I'll always have a map. Why do I need to know this? But as I started exploring this land more and more, I started realizing the level of texture and detail that is missed when it says Jesus went from Galilee to Jerusalem or on the journey to Jerusalem or something like that. If you don't pay attention to that, you lose a huge amount of meaning, that he was transiting the whole distance when he made that run. That when we go from Bethlehem to presenting at the temple to boom, we're up in Galilee again. That's a significant journey. And people had time to think and to reflect and to say, what does all this mean? And Mary herself, nobody was more sure of what God was doing than Mary. I mean, goodness gracious. Or more sure that God was doing something. That she had a lot of time to think on that. And the disciples, when they made the journey, had a lot of time to think on it. And I don't know that I ever realized that when I was just reading the text. So come back next week, and our pilgrims from this last journey will give their reflections and invite you into a little bit of what they experienced. And then we will be in church in about 14 minutes. Thank you all so much.